Title: The Weight of Unfinished Goodbyes. Chapter 1: The Quiet Aftermath. And the house had always been too quiet. But after she died, it was as if the silence became something alive, filling every corner, every crevice, with a deep, suffocating presence. Joanna's absence was palpable in the way the air shifted, the way even the walls seemed to hold their breath, as if they too were waiting for something. It had been 2 weeks since she passed, 2 weeks since that god-awful night when their child was born. And she died, a terrifying twist of fate that neither of them had ever expected. Joran had been there. He had watched the doctors rush around her, the frantic movements of the nurses and the sickeningly calm way they delivered the news. He had been so sure that things would be fine, that life would continue the way it always had. But it hadn't. It was over before it even began. Joanna, the love of his life, was gone, and all that remained was this silence. The baby, Jonathan, had been born healthy, perfect, with a loud wail that echoed through the sterile hospital room. That was the only sound that had filled the air for weeks after. His cries, his gurgles, the sound of a life still moving forward in the face of the deepest loss. But Joran had never known how to live in a world that would no longer have Joanna in it. There were nights when the silence felt almost unbearable. He would sit at the kitchen table, staring into the dimly lit room, his hands trembling as he held a cup of cold coffee that had long gone stale. The clocks on the wall ticked away the minutes, but they felt wrong, out of sync with the rest of the world. The space felt so small, so confined, as though the walls were closing in on him. Sometimes, just the sound of his own heartbeat would drive him to the edge. His head would spin. He would stand up and pace, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpets of the house. Yet still, there was that quiet presence following him everywhere. He knew he wasn't truly alone. Not really. She's here, he thought. Every time the stillness would grow unbearable, when the house would settle into an odd rhythm as if the air itself were exhaling, he would hear things, faint sounds from the kitchen, soft whispers at the edge of his hearing. The first time it happened, Joran had woken in the middle of the night, a cold sweat slicking his back. His eyes, blurry with sleep, had caught the faintest figure standing by the window. He blinked and rubbed his eyes, but when he looked again, it was gone. Just the darkness of the room staring back at him. Yet something had felt off. Since then, it had gotten worse. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just the weight of his grief playing tricks on him, that he was imagining things. But the whispers continued, always in the corner of his mind, always too quiet for him to fully make sense of. Sometimes, when he sat in the living room, he would hear a faint sound, a chair scraping against the floor, a soft footstep. His body would freeze, and his chest would tighten, as if a shadow had brushed against him. He'd tell himself it was the house settling, that there was a perfectly logical explanation, but logic was wearing thin. Joran couldn't explain the flicker of light he saw one evening, the way the chandelier swayed ever so slightly when there was no wind, or the way the bedroom door had opened on its own one cold morning when he was getting out of bed. He had asked the neighbours, told them about the strange occurrences, and they'd smiled sympathetically, brushing it off as a common occurrence in old houses. The creaks of old wood, the faint noises that would come in the middle of the night. Nothing to worry about, they assured him. But there was something else, something different, something that seemed to move through the air, through the house, with a mind of its own. The presence. It wasn't just the creaking of the floorboards, it was the way the house seemed to react to him. Joran felt it in the air. When he passed through the hallway, it felt colder than it should be, the hairs on his neck rising. And at night when he couldn't sleep, he would catch glimpses out of the corner of his eye. Shadows, fleeting, just out of reach of his understanding. He'd turn, but there would be nothing there. Nothing except the weight of something unseen pressing down on him. The silence would pulse, almost like a heartbeat, and then he would hear it, the whisper. At first, he thought it was the wind, but there were no open windows. And the whisper, it wasn't quite like anything he'd ever heard before. It was like a memory, something half remembered. Something he couldn't fully grasp. He would hear it when he stood near the crib, his hands resting against the rail, staring at his son as he slept. "Don't forget me." It wasn't the voice of the child, still too young to speak. It wasn't even his own voice. It was hers. Joanna. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was still in the room with him, still here. She hadn't left. And as the days passed, this unsettling presence, this weight of the unknown, only grew stronger. Joran tried to reach out. He tried speaking to her, hoping against reason that somehow, if he spoke her name aloud enough, she might respond. "Joanna," he whispered, his voice ragged with grief, with longing. "Please, come back." But no answer came, only silence. And that was the worst part. The silence. It was the kind that sat too heavily in the corners of the house, pushing in on him with every breath he took. It was oppressive, unyielding, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape it. He could feel her, hear her, but when he reached out, when he tried to call her back, there was nothing. Nothing but his own reflection staring back at him from the mirror. "She's gone," he would tell himself. "She's gone, and you're just imagining things." But there was always a part of him that knew she was still there. The baby's room. It was in Jonathan's room where the feeling of her presence was the strongest. Joran spent most of his time there now, pacing the room in the dark, staring down at his son as he slept peacefully. He couldn't help it. He needed to feel connected to Joanna. As he watched Jonathan's small form rise and fall with each breath, Joran thought about all the things they had missed. Joanna never got the chance to raise their son. She never got the chance to hold him or see him grow. But Joran swore that he would be the father she would have wanted him to be. He would raise Jonathan to be strong, to carry on her memory. And yet, every time he looked at his son, the whispers would return. "Don't forget me." It was faint, but there. The voice, distant but clear in his mind. Sometimes he would hear it during the daytime too, in the kitchen or when he was walking down the hall. He'd stop in his tracks, frozen, and wait for it to come again. He tried calling out, asking if anyone was there, but no one ever responded. Just the quiet murmur of the house, until one night, when the whispers became louder. It was late, and Jonathan was crying again. Joran hadn't been able to sleep for hours, and he had just finished changing the baby when he heard it. The softest whisper of a voice, too soft to be Jonathan's, too familiar to ignore. "I'm here." Joran spun around, his breath caught in his throat, heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the dim light from the crib, casting a long, thin shadow across the floor. His head was spinning, his mind reeling. Had he heard that? Had he really heard that? No answer came, but the feeling, the presence, was undeniable. It was her. Joanna's spirit was still with him, still watching, still waiting. Joran couldn't explain it. He couldn't understand it. But at that moment, he didn't need to. He simply needed to believe, to hope, to grasp onto something, anything, that could pull him from the edge of his grief. For the first time in days, he spoke the words aloud, his voice trembling but determined. "Joanna, please, don't leave us." End of chapter 1. Of this expanded chapter 1 builds on the themes of grief, loss, and the growing tension between the living and the dead. The psychological horror grows as Joran's mind becomes consumed by the belief that his wife's spirit is still with him, and the line between reality and the supernatural begins to blur. The chapter sets up the eerie atmosphere and the internal conflict that will continue to intensify in the following chapters. Chapter 2. The Unseen Hand. The silence in the house was a weight, a constant presence that pressed against Joran's chest, suffocating him with every breath he took. Every room, every corner of the house that had once been full of life and laughter, now felt hollow. He didn't know how much longer he could stand it. The emptiness of the place was crushing. Joanna's absence was a physical thing, as real as the air he breathed. She was everywhere and yet nowhere. Since her death, the house had become a place of strange echoes, fleeting glimpses, and uncomfortable stillness. Even the slightest noise seemed magnified. He could hear the ticking of the clock in the living room. Tick-tock, tick-tock, every second dragging on as if time itself had been altered. The house wasn't just quiet, it was waiting. He could feel it in his bones. The walls seemed to breathe with him, the air thick and stagnant, unwilling to move. Each night, after Jonathan had gone to sleep, Joanne would stand in the middle of the room, looking at the empty space that once held his wife. The nursery was the worst. He couldn't bring himself to go in there unless absolutely necessary. It was too much, too painful. But every time he passed the door, a shiver would crawl up his spine, a sense that someone was watching him, waiting. And sometimes, just sometimes, he would hear the softest whisper, like a distant murmur, a breath on the edge of his consciousness. He thought it was just the wind, or maybe his mind playing tricks on him. But it was always there, don't forget me. At first he had dismissed it as grief. He had told himself that the voice in his head was nothing more than the residue of his mourning, his heart's desperate plea to bring her back. But the more he heard it, the more it began to feel like something else, something real. Step too far. It had been a week since he had first heard the voice. Since that night, he had begun to question his own sanity. Grief could do strange things to a person. He knew that. It could make you see things that weren't there. It could twist your mind, making you think you heard a voice or saw shadows move when they shouldn't. But there were moments, brief moments, when the house seemed to feel alive. It wasn't the creaking of the old beams or the rattle of windows in the wind. It was something else, something he couldn't explain. One evening after dinner, Joanne sat alone in the kitchen. Jonathan was in his crib, sleeping soundly, and the house had fallen into that all-encompassing silence. He tried to eat, to force down the food, but his stomach was tight. Nothing tasted right anymore. The weight of the grief hung over everything, even the simplest tasks. He was chewing mechanically, his mind elsewhere. She's here. The thought flashed through his mind without warning, sharp and sudden. He froze mid-chew, his fork hovering in the air. The room was as silent as ever, but a chill swept through the kitchen, making his breath catch. He felt it, the presence. It started as a soft rustling, just behind him, like the sound of fabric brushing against skin. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Slowly he turned, expecting nothing, but there, just behind the doorway to the living room, stood the faintest figure, a shadow at the edge of the light. For a moment, he couldn't move. His heart slammed in his chest, panic rising in his throat. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching him. His breath came out in shallow gasps as he stared at the spot, the whispering voice from before echoing in his mind. Louder now. Don't forget me. His hands trembled as he slowly placed his fork down on the table. Joanna? He whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. It didn't even acknowledge him. But the air thickened. The silence grew heavier, pressing in on him, suffocating him from all sides. It was as if the room had drawn in a breath, holding it, waiting for something to happen. Joran stood frozen, his legs unsteady beneath him. But as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone, vanishing into the darkness, as if swallowed by the walls themselves. Joran's heart was pounding in his chest. His mouth felt dry, and his thoughts were racing. What the hell just happened? His mind screamed at him to run, to get away from the oppressive air, but his body refused to move. He was trapped in the moment, trapped in the house, with no way out of the spiraling madness that seemed to grip him tighter with each passing day. Shifting realities. The next few days blurred into one another, a string of restless nights and endless days spent trying to keep his mind focused on anything other than the house, the grief, and the growing sense of something watching him. The whispers were getting worse, louder, clearer, more frequent. It wasn't just at night anymore. The voice would follow him throughout the house, echoing in his mind, curling around his thoughts like a snake, reminding him of Joanna's absence, pulling at the edges of his sanity. He tried to tell himself it was the isolation, that it was just a phase, that his mind was simply grasping at straws in the wake of his wife's death. But the more he tried to push it away, the more it seemed to press in on him, like an unseen hand pulling him deeper into the shadows. One afternoon, while Jonathan napped, Joran found himself wandering the house aimlessly. He couldn't bring himself to sit down. The silence was too much. He walked through the living room, the hallway, and finally, with no real reason, found himself standing outside Joanna's old study. The door was cracked open, just a sliver, as though someone had been there, standing just inside. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking with a sound that echoed through the empty house. He stepped inside. The room smelled of dust, of papers left untouched for too long. The furniture was covered with sheets, as though the house itself was mourning her absence. He crossed the room, his eyes catching on the familiar objects. Joanna's books, the photograph of the two of them at their wedding, the little trinkets she had collected over the years. But it wasn't the room itself that caught his attention. It was the feeling. The air here was different. He could feel it pressing against his skin, thick with the weight of her memory. The room was alive in a way the rest of the house wasn't. The whisper came again, so clear, so real, as though it were standing right next to him. "I'm here. I've always been here." Joran spun around, his heart slamming against his ribs. But there was no one there. The room was empty, just like it had been for weeks. But the feeling hadn't left. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with a kind of energy, like they were alive, aware, watching. His hands gripped the edge of the desk, and for a long moment he stood there, staring at the empty room, trying to calm the rising panic in his chest. The truth was beginning to sink in. He wasn't just grieving anymore. He wasn't just missing her. He was haunted by her, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The return of the unseen. That night, as he lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, the whispers returned again, louder now, as though they were no longer confined to the edges of his mind. They were coming from all around him, filling the room with a suffocating presence. His body froze, paralyzed by a deep, gnawing fear. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a presence, and it was in the room with him. The darkness seemed to press in on him, the shadows stretching and crawling along the walls, reaching toward him, filling the space with something otherworldly. The voice became clearer, sharper, louder. "I never left. Don't forget me, Joran. I'm still here. I'm still waiting." Joran couldn't breathe. His heart thudded in his chest, and his body refused to move, as though the room had become a prison, trapping him in its suffocating grasp. He wanted to scream, to call out for help, but the words caught in his throat. There was no one to hear him, no one but the presence that had followed him, that had always been there, haunting the house, waiting for him to acknowledge it. And he could no longer deny it. It wasn't just in his mind. It wasn't just grief. Joanna was here. And she was not leaving. End of chapter 2. When this expanded chapter 2, the haunting presence of Joanna begins to push Joran's mental and emotional limits. The subtle manifestations of her ghostly presence build in intensity, creating a sense of escalating paranoia and tension. The line between the living and the dead becomes increasingly blurred for Joran as he grapples with his grief and the eerie presence of his late wife in the house. The feeling of being trapped in a spiraling madness heightens the sense of psychological horror in the story. Chapter 3. The Echoes in the Walls. The house was too quiet. At first, it had been a refuge from the noise of the world, a place of solitude where Joran could grieve in peace, away from the questions and the pitiful looks of others. But now, silence had become its own kind of nightmare, a soundless scream that reverberated through every corner of the house. The days blurred together, merging into an endless stretch of time, and every night felt like the same suffocating moment, like an eternal echo of everything he had lost. Joran woke up in the dark again, a cold sweat slick on his skin, his heart hammering in his chest. His eyes flicked to the side of the room, expecting the familiar outline of the dresser, the crib with Jonathan, the window where the moonlight always crept through. But his gaze locked on something else, something out of place. The door to the nursery was cracked open, just a sliver of darkness, as if someone had been watching him, waiting for him to wake up. It had been happening more often now, the feeling of being watched, and not just watched, but known. As if the house itself had become sentient, aware of his every move, of every moment he spent within its walls. His breath quickened, and he forced himself to look away. It's just the grief, he told himself. But the thought only made his pulse race faster. His thoughts were tangled, disjointed, spiraling. He had to get up. He had to check. The hallway of secrets. Joran slowly swung his legs over the side of the bed, the creak of the floorboards under his feet too loud in the silence. He stood, his legs unsteady as he made his way down the hallway. The moonlight spilled through the windows, casting long, thin shadows that seemed to twist and flicker. It was like the house itself was alive, breathing, moving with the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Every step he took felt heavier, as though the air around him was thickening, pressing down on him. The house felt different, like something had changed since the last time he had walked through it. He reached the nursery door and paused, his hand on the knob. For a moment, he wondered if he should just leave it alone, if he should go back to bed and pretend like he hadn't heard the whispers in the walls, like he hadn't seen the faint movement at the corner of his vision. But the air was suffocating now, thick with something intangible, something he couldn't name. The weight of it pressed against him like a cold hand on his chest. He pushed the door open, his heart racing, expecting to find nothing. Of course, there was nothing. There was no reason to fear. He was just imagining things, just still grieving. But when the door opened fully, he froze. The room was wrong. The crib, once untouched, now swayed gently in the dark, as though someone had just left it. No one had been in here. No one had been in the room since Jonathan had fallen asleep. He glanced over at the window. Closed. The light from the moon bathed the room in a soft glow, and yet there was a coldness in the air, a chill that seeped into his bones. No one has been here, he repeated to himself, though the thought felt hollow, meaningless. The whispering started again, so faint, so soft that he couldn't tell if it was his imagination or something more. He stood rooted to the spot, unable to move. Don't forget me. The voice was so clear now, so sharp in his mind, as if it were coming from the air itself. The sound of it was almost tangible, a presence that surrounded him, pulling him in. Joanna's voice, her sweet, familiar voice, so full of love and warmth, yet now twisted with something he couldn't place, something desperate. He snapped his head toward the crib, but there was nothing, no figure standing there, no shadow leaning over the baby. Jonathan lay in his crib, his small chest rising and falling with each breath, blissfully unaware of the terror that seemed to be suffocating his father. Joran's hand gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white with the pressure. He should leave. He should just turn around and leave the room, walk away from the suffocating weight that had settled in the air. But the pull of the whispers was too strong. His eyes flicked back to the crib, and for a fleeting moment, he could have sworn he saw something. A figure, standing just by the window, watching him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. No, it wasn't real. It couldn't be. The shadow in the corner. The following days were filled with an unbearable, growing tension. Joran didn't sleep much anymore. How could he? The moment his eyes closed, the whispers began again. So soft, like the rustling of leaves or the faintest breath of wind through the trees. It wasn't enough to keep him awake, but it was enough to make every moment feel like an intrusion. His mind was fracturing under the strain, every corner of the house haunted by her presence. Joanna's absence had become something palpable, something alive, and it pressed against him with every step he took. It started to affect his thoughts, his perception. At night, when the house was still and quiet, Joran would catch sight of things, glimpses of movement out of the corner of his eye, shadows that shifted when they should not have. It wasn't just the grief anymore. He could feel it now, something lingering in the edges of his vision, something waiting, watching him. He would spin around quickly, expecting to catch the figure in the act, but each time there was nothing, just the heavy silence of the house, the quiet sound of his breath. The air in the house was too thick, too oppressive. The walls felt as though they were closing in on him, suffocating him in the very space that had once been filled with warmth and love. The whispers grew louder, and sometimes he would hear them even in the presence of others. He had begun to isolate himself, avoiding contact with the neighbors, turning away from family visits. He couldn't explain what was happening to him, and he was afraid to even try. That was the breaking point. One evening, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows began to stretch long across the house, Joran found himself standing in the hallway, staring at the door to the bedroom. His eyes were wide, bloodshot from lack of sleep. His hands were shaking. "She's here." The whisper, so clear now, resonated in his mind, and his chest constricted with panic. He turned, his eyes darting toward the room where the baby slept. Jonathan, still innocent, still pure, lay in the crib, his tiny hands curled in the soft blankets. But even his peaceful presence couldn't calm Joran's racing heart. He moved through the house, his footsteps a muted echo in the darkness. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch after him, and every creak of the floorboards felt like an omen. The whispers grew louder now, a chorus of Joanna's voice calling to him, beckoning him. His hands trembled as he reached for the doorframe of their bedroom. "Joanna?" His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "Joanna, are you there?" The air seemed to grow colder, denser. His breath fogged in front of him as though he had stepped outside into the winter cold. But there was no coldness in the room, no windows open, no drafts. Just the heavy, oppressive air that seemed to swallow him whole. He stepped forward cautiously, his heart hammering in his chest. As he entered the room, the floor beneath him seemed to shift, and he stumbled slightly, his head spinning. He turned to the window, half expecting to see her standing there, watching him as she had in life. But it was empty. The room felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. The whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to intensify. They were all around him now, inside his mind, wrapping around him like tendrils. I never left. Joran's vision blurred, his body trembling with the strain of holding on to reality. The room began to pulse with energy, and the walls seemed to close in on him, the darkness thickening. It was as if the very air had come alive with her presence, suffocating him. "She's not gone. She's here. She never left." With a sudden, overwhelming panic, Joran rushed toward the crib, reaching for Jonathan, needing something to ground him, needing the reassurance that he wasn't losing his mind completely. His hands gripped the crib, the trembling subsiding as he focused on the baby's soft breaths, the small rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. But as he stood there, the whispers grew louder, and just for a moment, he swore he saw something. A figure, standing at the edge of the room, watching him with an intensity that made his heart stop. No, it was impossible. It wasn't real. He was losing himself. Chapter 3. In Chapter 3, the tension mounts as Joran becomes further entangled in his own spiraling paranoia. The atmosphere grows thicker, with supernatural events escalating as he struggles to distinguish reality from his own deteriorating mental state. Joanna's presence becomes more palpable, and Joran begins to lose his grip on what's real, consumed by the growing dread that he's never truly alone. The boundaries between life and death blur further, leaving him trapped in a world where he is constantly haunted by the echoes of his lost love. Chapter 4. The Fractured Silence. The house had always been quiet, but lately it felt as if it had swallowed every sound, leaving only the crushing weight of silence in its wake. The walls creaked like bones, and the floors groaned with every step Joran took. At first, it had been comforting. Isolating, yes, but at least it allowed him to grieve in peace. But now, the stillness felt like something alive, something malevolent, watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. The silence was no longer just a backdrop to his sorrow. It was the only thing that seemed real anymore, and that was what frightened him the most. Every day, the house seemed to close in on him a little more, the shadows stretching farther, the air growing heavier. The light from the outside world barely made it past the thick curtains. Even the sunlight felt wrong now, like it was filtered through a fog that couldn't be seen. He tried to ignore the feeling, but it gnawed at him, clawing at the edges of his consciousness, reminding him that something was terribly off. He would hear things in the night, soft creaks, faint footsteps, whispers that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. At first, he had told himself it was nothing, It was just the house settling, the wind, or maybe even his mind playing tricks on him. But the more time passed, the more the strange occurrences piled up. The whispers, always so faint, so distant, became more frequent. And now they were unmistakable. "Don't forget me, Joran." It was her voice. Every time it was her voice, he was sure of it. He could feel it in his chest. The deep ache of longing that pulled him toward her. A call he couldn't ignore. Joanna. The name burned his tongue every time he whispered it into the empty house, hoping against hope that she would answer. The mirror of his mind. It started innocently enough. The flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. The brief impression of someone standing in the hallway, just outside the kitchen. He would turn quickly, his heart pounding, only to find the space empty, just as it should be. But the feeling remained. She was here, he thought. She was always here. One evening, after Jonathan had gone to sleep, Joran found himself standing in front of the bedroom mirror. He didn't know what had brought him there, whether it was the whispers or the overwhelming sense that he needed to face whatever was haunting him. He stared at his reflection, watching as his image seemed to distort in the dim light. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt from sleepless nights. He looked lost, a shell of the man he once was. His thoughts spun out of control. Was she really here? Was he losing his mind? The whispers were louder now, clearer, and they seemed to come from all directions. They were inside his head, threading through his thoughts like a dark current, drowning out everything else. He couldn't stop them. They were so insistent, so certain. "I'm here, Joran." He wanted to scream, to shout that it wasn't possible, that he was just imagining it all. But deep down, in the quietest corner of his mind, he knew. He wasn't imagining it. Joran's eyes flicked to the doorway. The hallway was dark, just a sliver of moonlight bleeding through the cracks in the curtains. His breath hitched. He was sure he saw something. No, someone, standing there. But when he turned, the hallway was empty. He spun around quickly, his pulse racing. The mirror reflected his face, pale, wide-eyed, frantic. But behind him, something moved. It was brief, just a shadow, but unmistakable. The breath in his chest caught. For a fleeting moment, Joran saw her. A figure, standing in the doorway of the bedroom, watching him with that familiar gaze. Her eyes, soft and loving, as they always had been. His heart skipped a beat. Joanna, but when he blinked, she was gone. The doorway was empty. Joran's mind reeled. He rubbed his eyes, hoping it was just exhaustion, hoping it was just a trick of the light. But the feeling, that suffocating weight, still hung in the air like smoke. She was here. He could feel her. He could hear her. But he couldn't see her. He couldn't touch her. He couldn't bring her back. The weight of unspoken words days passed in a haze, each one bleeding into the next, like a painting smeared with too many layers of paint, colors mixing together until it became nothing more than a blur. Joran couldn't remember the last time he had felt truly awake, truly present. His thoughts were fragmented, drifting in and out of focus. The house seemed to swallow him whole, and when he tried to reach out for something real, something tangible, all he grasped was air. It was the morning of the 4th day in a row that Joran couldn't get out of bed. Jonathan had woken early, crying as babies do, but even the sound of his son's distress couldn't rouse him. It was as if he had become trapped in a dream. The weight of everything, his grief, his confusion, the never-ending whispers, pressed down on him, and all he could do was lie there. What was the point? What was he supposed to do? He heard the soft sound of Jonathan's cries again. Then, the floorboards creaked. Joran's eyes snapped open, his breath ragged. He sat up in bed, heart hammering in his chest. That wasn't the wind. That wasn't the house settling. It was a footstep. Someone was walking down the hallway, a soft, steady tread, slow but deliberate. His blood ran cold. Joanna. He hesitated, torn between fear and the desperate longing to see her, to feel her again. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his knees buckling slightly as he stood. His mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the moment he stepped into the hallway, he would see her standing there. And if he did, what would happen? Would she speak to him? Would she acknowledge him? He didn't know if he could handle it. The steps grew louder, closer. "Don't be afraid," the voice whispered in his ear, faint but unmistakable. I'm here with you." Joran staggered toward the door, his heart racing, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He opened the door cautiously, the soft creak of the hinges too loud in the silence. He stepped into the hallway, his body tense, his eyes darting from corner to corner. The hallway was empty, no figure, no movement. But the air was thick with something that made it hard to breathe. The house felt alive, vibrating with an unseen force. Joran's eyes lingered on the empty space in front of him, trying to make sense of what he had just felt. The presence of her, right there, just out of sight. He had heard her, hadn't he? The whispers began again, growing louder this time, until they filled the entire space. "Don't forget me, Joran." His knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor. The weight of it, everything, crashed down on him. The grief, the longing, the horror of it all. It felt like the house was closing in on him, suffocating him under its invisible weight. The walls pressed in. The shadows seemed to stretch, curling around him like fingers, and the whispers, Joanna's voice, repeated, over and over, like an endless chant. He squeezed his eyes shut, clenching his fists against the floor, desperate to shut out the sound, to block it out. This isn't real, this can't be real. And then, silence. The world around him seemed to freeze, the whispers cut off mid-breath. He opened his eyes, and the house was still again. The air was thick with tension, but there was nothing else. No shadows, no figures, no whispers, just the heavy silence that had once been his enemy. The silence that now felt like the final breath before the storm. At the price of love, Joran stood, his legs trembling beneath him. He didn't know how long he had been on the floor. The house was quiet again. He looked down at his hands, stained with sweat, and realized they were shaking uncontrollably. She's gone. She's gone. But deep inside he knew Joanna hadn't left. She had never truly left. And no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, she was still here. She would always be here. He could hear her now, whispering in the corners of his mind, in the shadows of the house. He could feel her in the walls, in the very air he breathed. And as much as he wanted to run, to flee, there was nowhere to go, no escape. The price of love, Joran realized, was this: being unable to let go, even when everything else had moved on. And now, it was too late. There was no turning back. End of chapter 4. In chapter 4, Joran's struggle with reality becomes even more pronounced as he confronts the supernatural presence of his wife, Joanna. The psychological horror escalates, and he is left questioning his own sanity as the boundaries between grief, delusion, and the paranormal blur. The tension builds to a breaking point as he is forced to face the terrifying truth. Joanna is still with him, and there is no escape from the weight of her memory. Chapter 5. The Weight of Shadows. The house felt like a living thing now. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that slipped through the cracks in the windows seemed to breathe, like the house was inhaling and exhaling in time with his own labored breath. Joran had stopped trying to explain it to himself. There was no logic, no sense in it anymore. The more he tried to make sense of it, the less real it all seemed. It was like trying to hold water in his hands, the reality slipping through his fingers every time he thought he understood it. She's still here, he thought, his mind whirling with the thought, even as the words chilled him to the bone. Joanna's presence was everywhere, creeping through the halls, lurking just outside of his awareness. It wasn't just that he could feel her. It was that he could hear her, see her, even though she wasn't really there. He had heard the whispers before, soft and distant, but now they were louder, insistent, always just at the edge of his consciousness. Sometimes, he would wake in the middle of the night, his body covered in a cold sweat, the air thick with the feeling of being watched. He would lie still, straining to hear, to catch any sound, but there was nothing. And yet, he could feel her, just beyond the door, just beyond the walls. It was a suffocating presence, one that filled every space of the house and clung to him like a shadow that would never leave. He had tried everything. He had tried to talk to her, to call out, to beg her to leave. But every time he did, the whispers grew stronger. The feeling of her presence grew heavier. It was as if the more he fought it, the more real it became. Joanna wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a spirit wandering the halls. She was something far worse. She was the echo of a love that could not die. The echoes grow louder. The days stretched on in a blur of exhaustion. Joran barely remembered what had happened between one day and the next. He had stopped caring about the world outside. The neighbors had stopped visiting. He hadn't gone to work in a week. What was the point? The house was his world now, and it was closing in on him, one room at a time. He spent hours wandering through the rooms, just waiting for something to happen. The shadows seemed deeper in some rooms, the air colder in others. Every step felt like a journey into the unknown, like the house itself was shifting, rearranging, bending to a rhythm only it could hear. Sometimes the walls would feel too close, as though the house were closing in on him, the ceilings lowering, the floors rising. The world outside seemed so far away, as though it had become irrelevant, meaningless, and still, the whispers. "You can't run from me, Joran. You can't escape me." It wasn't just in his mind anymore. Sometimes, he would hear it when he was walking down the hall. A voice, soft and insistent, almost like a breath on the back of his neck. He'd spin around, his pulse racing, but there was nothing. No one. Only the stillness of the house, the soft hum of silence. One evening, as the sun began to set and the house grew darker, Joran found himself standing in front of the old photo album that Joanna had kept on the shelf. He hadn't looked at it in months, but tonight, for some reason, he felt the need to see it. To see her. He pulled it from the shelf with trembling hands, the familiar scent of dust and aged paper filling his nostrils. The pages were yellowed, the photographs faded with time. There was one of Joanna and him, standing in front of their first apartment, smiling as they held hands, their faces full of hope. Another of their wedding day, their smiles so bright it was almost unbearable to look at. And then there were pictures of Jonathan, the baby that had brought them both so much joy. The pictures of a life that had been, in a sense, perfect. But now, as he flipped through the pages, the joy felt empty. The images blurred together, like a dream fading away upon waking. They didn't feel like memories anymore. They felt like something lost, something that no longer belonged to him. He turned the page, and his breath caught in his throat. There, among the pictures of their life together, was a photo he hadn't remembered seeing before. It was a picture of the two of them, but something was wrong. Something about the way she was looking at the camera. It was almost too intense. The look in her eyes was deep, unnervingly so, as though she were looking through him, into something beyond the frame. And in the corner of the photo, just barely visible, was a shadow. A shape that wasn't quite right. Joran's hand trembled as he reached for the photo, but the image wavered in front of his eyes, shifting, changing. The shadow in the corner seemed to move, flickering in the dim light. His heart raced. No, this wasn't possible. But there it was. The shadow was moving. He blinked and rubbed his eyes, but when he looked again, the photo was perfectly still. The shadow was gone. Was he losing it? Was he imagining things? A fractured mind days turned into weeks. Joran's routine was broken. There were moments when he couldn't remember what he had done the day before. His mind had become fragmented, like shards of glass that didn't quite fit together anymore. He would sit for hours in the living room, staring at the walls, waiting for something to happen. The house was silent, yet it never felt quiet. The whispers grew louder, more desperate. Sometimes when he sat in the dark, he would hear them come from all directions. "I'm here, Joran. I'm still here." The walls pressed in on him, suffocating him with every passing second. He couldn't escape them. He couldn't escape her. The presence, the weight, the shadow. It was all-consuming. His own reflection in the mirror had become a stranger to him. His face, drawn and hollow-eyed, stared back at him with the same look of disbelief he had when he first realized what was happening. But even his reflection seemed wrong, like it wasn't really him. One night, unable to stand it any longer, Joran made his way to the basement. The basement had always been a place they avoided, a dark, musty room where forgotten things went to die. But tonight, the thought of going there seemed almost comforting. There, in the silence, maybe he could find answers. Maybe, in the depths of the house, he could find some kind of peace. He descended the stairs slowly, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The air grew colder as he moved deeper into the house, the darkness settling in around him. He turned on the light at the bottom of the stairs, but the glow did little to cut through the oppressive blackness. He was standing in the center of the basement, surrounded by boxes, old furniture covered in sheets. Everything felt so still, so dead, and yet there was something else. A presence, just out of reach. Something that had always been there, waiting for him. His heart hammered in his chest as he took another step. But then the floor creaked beneath him, startling him. He froze. He had heard it, a soft footstep just behind him. He spun around, his pulse racing. No one. The room was empty, but the air was thicker now, pressing in on him. The whispers returned, louder, more insistent. "I'm here, I'm waiting for you." Joran's breath hitched. He wanted to run, to get out, to escape. But his body wouldn't move. His legs were frozen, rooted to the floor. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch out toward him, curling and twisting, reaching for him. The whispers grew louder. "You can't escape. You're already lost." The walls felt as though they were closing in. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The presence was here. It was real, and it was all-consuming. He turned toward the stairs, ready to flee. But as he did, something caught his eye. In the corner of the room, by the old trunk, he saw it. A figure, Joanna. She was standing there, her face pale, her eyes empty, watching him with that same unblinking gaze from the photo. She was so close, and yet she wasn't really there. The shadow she cast twisted and bent, its edges bleeding into the walls, into the floor. Her form was a wisp, a ghost, nothing more than a memory made flesh, but it was her, and it was impossible. Chapter 6. The Descent into Madness. The house had always been an anchor, sturdy, familiar, a place to call home. It had once been a sanctuary, a space where Joran could retreat from the world and gather his thoughts. But now it was a cage, its walls pressing in on him, its floors shifting beneath his feet, as though the very foundation was alive, suffocating him with every passing day. Each morning felt like a battle to wake up, to peel his body from the sheets that had become his prison. He barely slept anymore, and when he did, it was always filled with nightmares. Dreams of Joanna, of her face, twisted with sorrow, of her hands reaching out to him, always just out of his grasp. He would wake up gasping for air, his heart pounding, the remnants of the dream lingering in his mind like a poison he couldn't shake off. And then there were the whispers that followed him everywhere, the soft, insistent murmurings that filled the air, threading their way through the silence of the house. At first, they had been faint, almost imperceptible. A distant hum, like the sound of the wind, or the creak of the house settling. But now, they were louder, more urgent, as though someone was always just behind him, breathing softly in his ear. "I'm here, Joran." He had heard it so many times now that it was starting to feel like a song he couldn't escape, a melody that played in his mind, looping endlessly. He could hear it in the stillness of the night, when the world outside was asleep, when the house itself seemed to hold its breath. "I'm here. I've never left you." Wandering forth the echoes of his mind. Joran had tried everything to drown it out. He had turned on the television, cranked up the music, even tried to read a book, but it was always there, hovering in the background like a shadow he couldn't shake off. The whispers weren't just in his head anymore. They had become a presence in the house, in every room, in every corner. It was as though the very walls were whispering to him, echoing with Joanna's voice, a voice that was so familiar, yet so full of grief. He couldn't remember when it had started, but now it was a constant, inescapable companion. Every room he entered, every hallway he walked down, the whispers followed him. and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, they always grew louder, always more persistent. The house, once a place of comfort, had become a labyrinth of terror. It was as though the air itself was thickening, closing in around him. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't understand, as if the house itself was alive, breathing with him, watching him, waiting for him to finally break. And break he did. He was already slipping. He knew it. The cracks in his mind were becoming more obvious now, the pieces of his once coherent thoughts starting to fall apart. There were moments when he would forget what he was doing, when he would lose time, staring at the clock and realizing that hours had passed without his knowing. His body felt detached from his mind, like he was walking through life in a fog, unable to find his way out. Come to a find of the room of shifting shadows. It was in the middle of one of these episodes, when he had lost track of time and found himself standing in the living room, staring at the empty fireplace, that it happened. The room felt different. It was colder now, the air sharp and biting, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun outside. The shadows in the room seemed longer, stretching in unnatural directions, their shapes twisting and moving with a life of their own. Joran stood there, frozen, his eyes locked on the shadows. For a moment, it was as though they were watching him, as though they were alive, observing his every movement, waiting for him to make the first move. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. It's just the light, he thought. It's just the shadows playing tricks on me. But as he took a step forward, the shadows seemed to follow him, shifting and curling around his feet like tendrils. He stopped, his heart racing. He could feel the weight of them, pressing in on him, closing the space between him and the door. And then, the whispers came again, louder this time, more insistent. Joran, his name. It was her voice. Joanna. He turned, but there was no one there. Just the empty room, the flickering shadows. And yet he could feel it. She was here. She was always here. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing tighter and tighter, the shadows wrapping around him like cold fingers. He staggered back, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to run, to escape, but his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen in place, held captive by the presence that surrounded him. She's here. The words echoed in his mind. She never left you. The truth beneath the surface. The days blurred together, and the house became a maze of shifting corridors, twisting rooms, and suffocating silence. Joran couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape her. He tried to leave. Once. Just once. He had made it to the front door, his hand resting on the cold brass handle. But when he stepped outside, the air was thick with the same oppressive presence. The house was watching him. It was always watching. He had tried to talk to someone. He had called his brother, hoping that hearing a familiar voice would ground him, would bring him some peace. But the moment he spoke, the words had become jumbled in his mouth, his tongue tripping over itself as if it had forgotten how to speak. And then, when he heard his brother's voice on the other end of the line, the whispering started again. Joran, what's happening to you? But the voice on the other end was no longer his brother's. It was hers, Joanna's voice, distant, echoing in the distance. The phone line had gone dead, and Joran was left alone, with the whispering, with the house, with the shadows. The unraveling. He couldn't escape it anymore. There was no outside world. There was no escape from the house. No escape from her. The walls were closing in on him, the air growing thicker with each passing moment. He had become a prisoner in his own mind, his own house, with no way to escape. And then, one night, as he lay in bed, the whispers came again. This time, they were louder, more urgent. I'm here, Joran. You're not alone. The words were clear now, the voice unmistakable. Don't forget me. He couldn't breathe. The room was suffocating him. The house was pressing in on him. The walls closing in. The whispers filling the air until it felt like they were inside his skull, in his thoughts, in his very soul. The shadows grew longer, darker, wrapping around him like a noose. He closed his eyes, but it didn't stop. The pressure didn't stop. The house, the shadows, the whispers, they were all around him, inside him, consuming him. And as he lay there, paralyzed by the weight of it, he realized the truth. There was no escape. Joanna had never left, and neither had he. End of chapter 6. In chapter 6, the haunting of Joanna intensifies, consuming Joran's every waking moment. The house becomes more oppressive, almost sentient, feeding off his fear and sorrow. His sense of reality continues to unravel as the boundary between the living and the dead blurs further. The oppressive presence of his wife's ghost is both psychological and supernatural, driving Joran to the brink of madness. He realizes that the house has become his prison, and there is no escape from either the past or his fractured mind. Chapter 7. The Collapse of Reason. The walls had become his world. Joran had stopped looking out the windows. He didn't see the outside anymore. There was nothing beyond the walls, nothing beyond the suffocating silence that clung to the air inside the house. The whispers followed him everywhere, growing louder, sharper, and with each passing hour, they seemed to be getting closer. His mind, once his refuge, had become a prison, the voices echoing in his skull like a broken record, looping endlessly, feeding his terror. "I'm here, don't forget me." Joanna's voice was a constant, a soft but persistent hum in the background of every thought. He had tried everything to block it out. He had tried talking to himself, trying to convince himself that it was just the grief, that it was just his mind breaking. But deep down, Joran knew the truth. He knew it as surely as he knew his own name. She was still here. The house was alive with her presence. The walls seemed to breathe. The floors creaked and groaned under his weight as though the house itself was responding to him. At times, Joran felt like he could hear her, feel her, just behind him, her presence pressing against him like a physical weight. But every time he turned, there was nothing, just the hollow, suffocating silence of the house. "It's all in your head," he thought. "It has to be. You're losing your mind." But even as he whispered the words to himself, he knew they weren't true. The hallway of mirrors. He hadn't ventured into the hallway in days, weeks maybe. It had become a place he couldn't bear to be, its shadows too long, its corners too dark. But tonight, something inside him, some dark, twisted part of his mind, drove him to walk down it. He stood at the threshold of the hallway, his hand resting on the doorknob. His body trembled as he turned the handle, stepping into the space that had once felt so familiar, so safe. But now, everything felt wrong. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, its walls pressing in on him, narrowing, as though the house itself were contracting, pushing him into the center of its suffocating grip. The air was thick, stifling, and as he stepped forward, Joran's breath hitched. There, at the far end of the hallway, was a mirror. It had always been there, a small, unassuming fixture. But tonight it felt different. He walked toward it, each step feeling heavier, his heart thumping in his chest. The closer he got, the more the whispering seemed to swell, until it was all he could hear, all he could feel. "I'm here. I'm still here." The voice was so clear now, so close, that it felt like it was coming from inside his own head. He reached the mirror, his breath fogging the glass, and for a moment, he just stared at his reflection. But his reflection wasn't quite right. Joran blinked, his mind reeling. The face staring back at him seemed wrong. His eyes, bloodshot and sunken, didn't match the emptiness he felt inside. And then, as he stared at his reflection, it shifted, just slightly, but enough to send a shiver down his spine. His lips curled into a smile that wasn't his. It was too wide, too unnatural. "Joanna!" His voice cracked, his chest tightening with fear. But the reflection only smiled wider, his own face twisted in the glass, contorting in a grotesque imitation of what he had once known. His eyes seemed to gleam with something dark, something cold, and the whispering came again, louder now, almost deafening. "I'm here. I'll never leave you." Joran stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands trembling as he reached for the wall to steady himself. His mind was spinning, his vision blurring as the world around him seemed to distort, to warp. The reflection in the mirror, It wasn't him. He wanted to scream, but the words were stuck in his throat. The air felt thick, oppressive, suffocating. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the reflection returned to normal. His face was there, as it should be, tired and worn, but nothing else had changed. The whispering had stopped. The mirror was just a mirror again. But Joran knew. He knew that something had changed. He echoed the voices in the walls. Joran couldn't shake the feeling that something was always watching him now. The house had never felt alive in this way before. It was as though the very air, the walls, the floors, they were all waiting for something to happen. Waiting for him to break. The whispers weren't just in his mind anymore. They were in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very fabric of the house itself. He would hear them when he sat in the living room, when he stood in the kitchen, when he walked down the hallway. Joran. At first he had thought he was imagining it. Grief, exhaustion, the weight of his sorrow had all started to take a toll. But now the whispers were undeniable. They weren't in his mind. They were coming from the walls. He had stopped asking himself if he was going crazy. The question seemed meaningless now. What did it matter if he was losing his mind, when it felt like the house itself had turned into a living thing? It was breathing, it was moving, it was watching him. "She's here," the walls whispered, the words sliding through the cracks in the wood like tendrils, seeping into his thoughts. "She never left. She's always here." Joran's pulse quickened as the whispers intensified. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, the house growing smaller, tighter, suffocating him with its weight. The shadows stretched further, pulling at him like hands, dragging him deeper into the darkness. He couldn't escape it. The whispers were everywhere now. He could hear them in the kitchen, in the living room, in the bedroom. Every room was filled with them, a chorus of voices, all chanting the same thing, over and over. "I'm here, don't forget me." The breaking point. By the time nightfall came, Joran had lost track of the days. It didn't matter anymore. He was trapped in the house, trapped in his own mind. The whispers, the shadows, they wouldn't stop. They were relentless. He couldn't escape. And then, in the dead of night, when the house was still, when everything was silent except for the beating of his own heart, Joran finally gave in. He had reached the edge, the point of no return. The weight of the whispers, the pressure of the house, the suffocating grip of grief, it all became too much. He found himself standing in the middle of the hallway again, staring at the darkened doorway that led to the nursery. Jonathan was asleep, his soft breaths barely audible from the other room. But Joran couldn't think of his son anymore. All he could think about was the presence that surrounded him, the presence that had been with him since the moment Joanna had passed. He was desperate for an answer, desperate to see her again. "Joanna!" His voice echoed in the dark, but there was no response. He walked down the hallway, his footsteps muffled by the carpet. The house felt colder now, the air thick with something wrong. As he reached the nursery door, he stopped. The door was cracked open, just slightly. A sliver of darkness peered back at him from the other side. Joran's hand hovered over the knob, his heart pounding in his chest. He pushed the door open slowly, inch by inch, and then he saw it. She was standing in the corner of the room. Not in the way he had imagined. No transparent figure, no glowing shape. She was solid, real, just as she had been before. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and filled with sorrow, but her presence was undeniable. She was there, in the room, just out of reach. Joanna. Her lips parted but no words came out. Her gaze flickered to him, and in that moment, he knew the house had been right. She hadn't left, but neither had he. He was trapped. End of Chapter 7. In Chapter 7, the supernatural forces that torment Joran reach a terrifying crescendo. His mental state continues to unravel as the boundaries between the living and the dead blur. The house itself becomes a living, breathing entity, suffocating him with every breath. The whispers and shadows grow more persistent, and the presence of Joanna becomes all-consuming. Joran is left questioning his sanity, but deep down, he knows the truth. He is trapped in a cycle of grief, madness, and supernatural terror, and there is no escape. Chapter 8: The Unraveling Threads. The house was a prison. Joran could feel the truth of it in every corner of the space. The walls, once comforting, now felt like the bars of a cell. The rooms were no longer just rooms. They were tombs. Tombs that held memories of a life that had once been. But now, those memories had turned against him, becoming twisted reflections of everything he had lost, everything he could never get back. Every inch of the house was saturated with the echoes of Joanna. Even the very air seemed to hold her, a suffocating presence that clung to him, whispering through the cracks, settling in the dust, always there. It had been weeks since he had first heard the whispers, but now they were no longer just faint echoes in his mind. They were omnipresent. They followed him from room to room, from one shadow to the next, like an inescapable cloud that hovered just above his head, blocking out the light of reason. He couldn't escape them. They were in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very air that he breathed. "Don't forget me. I'm here. You can't run from me." The voice was everywhere, familiar, intimate, yet distorted, like an echo from the other side of a vast, endless chasm. Joran had stopped questioning whether he was hearing things. It didn't matter anymore. He knew deep down in the pit of his soul that Joanna was still here, not as a ghost, not as a spirit wandering aimlessly through the house, but as something other, something that had rooted itself in the very fabric of his existence, something that had crawled into his mind and refused to leave. Every time he tried to resist, to escape, to convince himself that it was all in his head, the whispers grew louder, the shadows grew longer. He would find himself standing in the kitchen, staring at the sink, hands shaking, only to realize that an hour had passed. Time no longer existed in the house. It was as though the very concept of it had slipped away, and he was left floating in an endless moment. The same moment, again and again. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could still see her face. The way her eyes had looked at him just before she died. The way her lips had parted to say something, to tell him something important. But the words had never come. The guilt gnawed at him. Was there something he could have done? Was there something he should have said? Some way he could have kept her with him? "Don't forget me, Joran. I never wanted to leave you." He tried to push the thought away, but it lingered, like a shadow that refused to be shaken off. Every room in the house seemed to press in on him, suffocating him with its weight. Every creak of the floorboards beneath his feet was like a reminder, a warning. The house was shifting again, and he was powerless to stop it. The house knew him. It knew his fears, his regrets, his desires, and it wasn't about to let him go. The nursery. The nursery had once been a place of joy. Joanna had decorated it with soft pastel colors, with a crib that seemed to shine in the gentle light of the morning sun. It had been their dream, a dream of parenthood, of raising their son together in the warmth of their love. But now, the nursery was nothing but a mausoleum, a place where the echoes of lost potential reverberated with every passing moment. Joran had stopped going in there. He couldn't bear it. But today, something was different. The air felt thick, almost alive with something he couldn't name. The whispering had been constant for days, but it had taken on a new urgency, an insistent tone that seemed to pull at him, as if it were calling him to the nursery. Joran didn't want to go. He knew what would happen if he did, but he couldn't stop himself. His feet carried him there, one step after the next, his body moving like it was being guided by some unseen force. As he reached the door, his hand hovered just above the knob, as if hesitating for one last moment, for some last shred of resistance. But he had no strength left, no will to fight. He opened the door. The room was exactly as he remembered it, empty, but filled with the lingering presence of everything that could have been. The crib sat in the middle of the room, untouched. The walls were still painted in soft shades of blue and yellow. The mobile, a beautiful wooden thing, still hung above the crib, its painted animals frozen in time. The rocking chair in the corner creaked slightly, as though someone had just been sitting there, and then, just as his heart began to slow, something caught his eye. The mobile. It began to move. At first, it was a slight shift, a soft spin. the faintest of movements. He rubbed his eyes, convinced it was some trick of the light. But no, the mobile was turning, slowly, methodically, as though someone was gently winding it up. Joran's breath hitched in his chest. This isn't real. This isn't real. But the mobile kept turning, and with it, the room seemed to shift. The shadows in the corners stretched, lengthened, growing darker, more oppressive. The air grew colder, and Joran felt a shiver run down his spine as the whispers came again. Louder this time. Joran? He turned his head quickly, expecting to see her, Joanna, standing there, watching him. But there was no one. No figure in the room. No one to explain what was happening. The whispering came again, clearer this time, cutting through the thick silence. I'm here. I've always been here, Joran. You're the one who left me. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing tighter against him, suffocating him. His hands reached out, trembling, and he touched the edge of the crib. It was cold. Too cold. He took a step back, feeling the weight of it all crash down on him, his vision blurred. He wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. You can't escape me, the voice whispered, so soft, so tender. I'm inside you now. I'm inside your head. You'll never be alone again. The mirrors in his mind. The whispering didn't stop. It followed him everywhere, like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Joran found himself walking through the house in a daze, his thoughts a jumble, his mind spinning out of control. He tried to ignore it. He tried to find some way to fight it, but every time he closed his eyes, it was there. Every time he looked in the mirror, it was there. The mirrors had become something else. At first, they had been simple reflections, glass that showed him what was. But now they were more than that. They were windows into something darker, something twisted. He had started to avoid them, to cover them with sheets, but the reflections would still come. He would catch glimpses of himself in the corners of his vision. His face, gaunt and hollow-eyed, staring back at him. But it wasn't just him anymore. It was her. His reflection warped, twisted into something he couldn't understand, something he didn't want to see. The mirror had started showing him things that weren't real. Joanna's face twisted with sorrow, her eyes empty, her lips parted in a silent scream. He would blink, and it would disappear. But the image was still burned into his mind. He couldn't escape it. The pressure of the unseen Joran spent the next few hours wandering through the house, moving like a man possessed. The walls seemed to close in on him. The floors felt like they were shifting beneath his feet. The house had become too small, too suffocating. Every step he took, he could feel the pressure building. The house was watching him, waiting for him to break. The whispers were louder now, more persistent, more urgent. They were inside his head, inside his soul. He could feel them pulling at the edges of his consciousness, tearing at the fragile threads of his mind. You can't escape me, Joran. You never could. He stumbled down the hallway, his hands trembling, his heart racing in his chest. The door to the basement loomed ahead of him, and for some reason he couldn't stop himself. He had to go down there. He had to confront whatever it was that had been waiting for him. He opened the door, and the stale air hit him immediately. The basement had always been cold, dark, and filled with forgotten things. But tonight, it felt different. It felt alive. The whispers were louder now, their voices echoing through the walls. I'm here, Joran. You can't escape me. You're mine. He took one step down the stairs, then another, until the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. The basement stretched out before him, filled with boxes and broken furniture. But in the center of it all, there was something else, something waiting for him. The shadows seemed to move, to shift. And as he reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw her. Joanna. She was standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide and vacant, her mouth opening as if to speak. But no sound came. The whispers echoed in the air, louder now, more frantic, as if they were alive, filling the room, suffocating him. I'm here, Joran. Don't forget me. He tried to move, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He was frozen in place, unable to tear his eyes away from the figure standing before him. It wasn't just a ghost. It wasn't just a memory. It was real. She was real. and she had come back for him. End of chapter 8. In chapter 8, the psychological horror deepens as Joran becomes further trapped in his mind and the suffocating presence of Joanna. The house itself becomes a maze, its walls closing in on him, while the whispers grow louder and more insistent. The line between the supernatural and his fractured psyche becomes impossible to distinguish, and he finds himself spiraling deeper into madness, unable to escape the relentless pull of his grief and the haunting presence of his wife. Chapter 9. The House of Echoes. The house no longer felt like a home. It was as if the walls themselves had become something else, something far older, far more ancient than the brick and wood that held them together. They had become alive. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that slipped through the cracks in the windows, every shift in the air as it hummed in the corners of the rooms. It all felt like something waiting for him, watching him. There was no hiding from it, no escaping it. Joanna, her name burned in his mind, relentless, like the echo of a sound that refused to die. He could feel her everywhere. Not in a literal physical form. No, it wasn't that simple. She was here, present in the space around him, trapped in the walls, the floors, the ceilings. Her voice had become the house's voice, murmuring in the silence, creeping through every crack, every whisper of wind. There was nowhere he could go where she wasn't. Her presence hung heavy in the air like an uninvited guest, a ghost that he could never escape. "I'm here, Joran. You can't run from me." The whispering had become a constant companion. It followed him from room to room, from hallway to hallway, from waking to sleeping. And there was no question in his mind anymore that it was her. Joanna's voice, soft and insistent, and yet twisted in ways that made his blood run cold. Her voice hadn't always been like this. It had once been warm, comforting, familiar. But now it was different. It was filled with something darker, something sharper, like an edge that cut through the stillness and left a mark on his very soul. Joran had stopped fighting it. What was the point? The more he resisted, the louder the whispers became. The more he tried to block them out, the more the house seemed to press in on him. Every corner he turned, every hallway he walked down felt tighter. The air was heavier. The house was shrinking, suffocating him, holding him in place, forcing him to confront the impossible. The kitchen of repetition. It was the kitchen that started it. The kitchen was always the same. The dishes never seemed to stack themselves. The countertops never cleaned themselves. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the air. The refrigerator hummed with the quiet monotony of everyday life. And yet, there was something else. Something that didn't belong. It was in the stillness. In the way the air hung, stagnant and thick. It was in the way the room seemed to warp at the edges, like it was bending, twisting under his gaze. Joran stood at the counter, his hands resting on the cool surface. He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't preparing anything. He wasn't trying to make himself a meal or even a cup of coffee. He was simply standing there, staring at the countertop. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded far too loud, echoing in his skull. It was the only sound in the room. Yet it felt oppressive, as if the very rhythm of time itself was pushing him to the brink of madness. "She's here. She's with you, always." Joran's hands began to tremble. His grip on the counter tightened, his knuckles going white. He looked down, but he couldn't make sense of it. There was nothing here. The kitchen was just as it always was. A place of routine, a place where life happened. But the air was thick, pulsing with a pressure that made his chest tighten. It was as if the room itself was watching him, waiting for him to react. Suddenly, there was a sound. Soft at first, like the faintest scratch, followed by the gentle clink of metal. His heart jumped in his chest as his eyes darted toward the sink. The spoon. The one he had left there hours ago, untouched. It had moved. It wasn't in the same place it had been before. No, that wasn't possible. The spoon wasn't just moved. It was placed deliberately on the edge of the sink, balanced in a way that was too precise, too intentional. Joran took a slow, steadying breath, and his mind fought to pull him back into some semblance of logic. "It's just the wind," he told himself. "It's just your imagination." But when he looked again, the spoon was gone, vanished. His body froze. His mouth went dry. The room around him began to warp, the walls seeming to shift, stretching and shrinking with the rhythm of his heartbeat. The air felt colder, heavier. She's here. She's with you. The whispering was louder now, filling the room with a sharp, insistent voice that echoed in his skull. He spun around, desperate for some kind of reprieve, but the kitchen remained empty. The silence pressed down on him like a weight, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. The only sound was his own heartbeat thudding in his ears, louder than anything else. The living house, Joran had to get out. He had to leave. The house was alive. He was certain of it. It wasn't just the whispers. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched. It was the house itself. It was changing, warping in ways he couldn't understand. The walls were breathing. The floors were shifting. And every corner of the house seemed to be watching him. Waiting. Leave, he thought, his hands trembling as he stumbled into the hallway. Get out before it's too late. But there was no escape. The hallway stretched before him, but the door, his door, the door that led to the outside world, wasn't there. It should have been, but it was gone, as if the house had swallowed it whole. The space before him was nothing but a hallway, a never-ending corridor that twisted and turned in impossible directions, its walls leaning in closer, closer, until they threatened to crush him. You can't leave, the whispering voice said, so soft now, so intimate. It was her voice, Joanna's voice, sweet and familiar, yet so full of something darker. You've never left me. We're forever bound, Joran. His legs shook beneath him. He couldn't breathe. The hallway stretched out ahead of him, too long, too narrow. The shadows reached out like hands, clawing at him, pulling him in, holding him in place. He tried to run, tried to force his legs to move, but it was like the house was holding him in place. The walls were pressing in on him, suffocating him, and the shadows were too thick to see through. She's here, always with you, always. The voice wasn't just in his mind anymore. It was in the walls, in the floors, in the very air that surrounded him. The house was alive with it. The house was a part of her, a part of him, and there was no escaping it. The whispers filled the space around him, flooding his mind, drowning him. I never left. I'm here, Joran. I'm always here. He wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The air was too thick, too heavy, pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. The walls were closing in, the shadows growing longer, more twisted, stretching toward him like the hands of something otherworldly. Joran's knees buckled beneath him, and he fell to the floor, gasping for air. The room was spinning, the walls were closing in, and the whispers were deafening. There was no escape, no way out. I'm here, always. The unseen end, Joran crawled toward the hallway, desperate to reach the door, desperate to get out. His mind was a blur, the whispers ringing in his ears, growing louder with every movement. He didn't know where the door was anymore. He didn't know where he was. The house had become a maze, its walls shifting and twisting, its rooms changing shape, pulling him deeper into the dark. You can't escape. The voice was louder now, almost physical, like it was inside his skull, pressing against his mind. He was suffocating. The air was too thick, the pressure too great. His body trembled, his heart racing in his chest. And then, in the depths of his fear, he realized the truth. The house had already claimed him. There was no escape. He was part of it now, a piece of it, and he would never leave. She's here, she's always here, and you'll never escape. The whispering faded, and the darkness took him. End of Chapter 9. In Chapter 9, Joran's unraveling reaches its peak. The house, once a place of refuge, has become a malevolent force, warping around him, suffocating him with its oppressive presence. The lines between his fractured mind and the supernatural blur beyond recognition, leaving him trapped in a cycle of terror that he cannot escape. His mental and physical state deteriorates, and as the pressure mounts, Joran realizes the terrifying truth. He is no longer just a resident of the house. He has become a part of it, forever bound to its dark, living grip. Chapter 10. The Final Descent. As the house was closing in, Joran could feel the walls pressing against him, could feel them creeping ever so slowly, but with the certainty of inevitability. The air was thick, laden with the suffocating weight of something alive. His thoughts, if they could still be called that, were fractured, pieces of shattered glass, each reflection a jagged edge that tore at him. He couldn't make sense of anything anymore. The past, the present, and even the future had become one endless, looping nightmare, a swirling vortex of confusion and terror. Time no longer existed. The ticking of the clock was only another reminder of how helpless he was, how trapped he had become in this house, in his mind. He had tried to run, tried to leave, but the house, it always pulled him back. He could feel it, like an invisible tether tying him to the very ground he stood on. The front door, his only perceived escape, was just an illusion. A wall had risen up in its place, solid and unyielding. No matter how hard he tried, the door was never really there. It had never been. It was too late to leave, too late to run. The house had become a part of him now, its pulse beating in time with his own. He could feel it, its presence, its essence, woven into the very fabric of his being. Each floorboard, each piece of furniture, each piece of dust that hung in the air. Was it Joanna's presence, or was it his own mind turning against him, twisting the space into something grotesque? He couldn't tell anymore. She's here. I'm here. We're both here. The whispering was louder now, almost deafening. It was in the walls, in the floors, in the very air he breathed. It was her, always her, speaking through the house, speaking to him. He had tried to silence it, tried to drown it out with every distraction his mind could find. But it was impossible. The more he tried, the more real it became, the more alive the house felt. Joran was running now, though he didn't know what he was running from. He couldn't escape the house. Every step felt like it led him further into its grasp. Like every direction was just another path in a labyrinth with no exit. He had long stopped trying to make sense of it. There was no point. There was no reason anymore. He was running toward nothing. The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty. The hallway, the stairs. Every room had become a mirror, a reflection of his own spiraling mind, a representation of everything he had lost, everything he could never get back. And in each reflection, she was there, Joanna. The mirror's truth. Joran stumbled into the bedroom. The door creaked as he pushed it open, but it didn't matter. The room was empty. The walls, though, were different. The room had always been the most familiar, his sanctuary, his and Joanna's place. The place where they had shared their life, their love, their dreams. But now, it was twisted, bent out of shape, like a warped version of itself. The shadows seemed darker, and the air had grown thick with the scent of something stale, something decayed. But there was the mirror, just as it had always been. And as he stood there, breathing in shallow bursts, he realized he could no longer avoid it. The mirror had become something else, something other. His reflection was distorted, his face pale, unshaven, eyes sunken deep into their sockets. He didn't recognize himself, but it wasn't just his appearance that scared him. It was the presence behind him, the shape in the corner of the mirror, standing just outside his field of vision. The shadows, they flickered, twisted, and the figure moved closer until its face was mere inches from his own. It was her. Joanna's face stared back at him, but it was twisted. Her eyes were empty, hollow, darkened like endless pits. Her mouth opened, and though no words came out, Joran could hear them, as clear as day. "I'm here, Joran. Don't you remember?" The mirror cracked, slowly at first, a web of fractures spreading across the glass. His reflection smiled, but it wasn't his smile. It was hers, a grotesque imitation of the life they once shared, a distorted memory of love. The crack in the mirror deepened. The room seemed to bend, the walls shifting as if they too were being consumed by the same madness. The whispers, now deafening, filled his ears. The air was thick with it, her, and the smell of decay, of death. Joran couldn't look away. His body was rooted to the spot. His mind was breaking, crumbling beneath the weight of it all. He didn't want to hear it anymore. He didn't want to see it. But the house, the mirror, it wouldn't let him go. "She's here," the voice whispered, growing louder with every passing second. "I'm here. I've always been here, Joran. You never left me. And you never will. The walls seemed to pulse, the floor under his feet quaking as if the house itself was alive, breathing. It wasn't just the whispering. It was the presence. It was everywhere, suffocating him, wrapping around his lungs, pulling him into the very heart of the house. The shadows reached out for him, the cracks in the walls widening, the dark corners of the room becoming something else entirely. You can't escape, Joran. You've always been here with me. We're bound together now, forever. The mirror shattered. The end of reality. Joran didn't scream. He couldn't. He had no voice left, no strength to fight against it. The reality of his existence had become so warped, so twisted, that even the thought of escape seemed absurd. He had tried to leave. He had tried to run. But there was nowhere to go. The house had him. The house was him. The floor beneath him shifted. His feet slipped, and he tumbled forward, his hands reaching out instinctively to break his fall. But there was nothing. The ground was gone. The walls were gone. The room had disappeared, leaving nothing but an endless void, a swirling vortex of darkness and whispers. You're mine, Joran. Forever. Forever with me. The voice was inside his skull now, inside his thoughts. He felt it, deep in his chest, deep in his bones. It wasn't just the house. It was his grief, his guilt. It was his mind breaking, shattering like the glass of the mirror. The presence of Joanna had been there all along, not just in the house, but in him. It had always been a part of him. We're together again, the voice whispered, soft and soothing. We never truly parted. The darkness closed in. Joran's mind, his very sense of self, began to unravel completely. The house had consumed him, just as it had consumed her. The boundaries between life and death, between the living and the dead, had long since ceased to matter. There was only this, only the suffocating presence of her, the endless whispers, the dark house that had become his only world, the house that had always been his home. And then, nothing. Epilogue. The endless silence. And so it ended, or perhaps it never truly began. The house, once a place of life, of hope, had become something else entirely. It had become a tomb, a dark, suffocating prison where time no longer flowed, and reality was a distant memory. Joran had been swallowed whole by it, his mind, his soul, his very existence bound to the house, to the walls, to the whispers. What once had been a place of love and comfort had twisted into a nightmare, a labyrinth of shadows that had no exit, no way out. The house remained silent now, its walls still, its corridors empty. But if one listens closely, one might hear it. A faint murmur, a whisper in the dark. I'm here, always here. Joran's name had long since faded from the house's memory, but Joanna's presence lingered. Not as a ghost, not as a fleeting shadow, but as something much more profound. Her love, her grief, her sorrow. It was all inside the house now, seeping into the very air that one breathed, wrapping itself around every corner, every room, every forgotten space. The house had become a reflection of her, a reflection of all that had been lost. For those who dared to enter, the house remained, a hollowed-out shell of a family's shattered past. And in the silence, in the dark, the whispers still echoed, faint but persistent, a warning, a reminder. The house was never truly empty. It was never truly abandoned. The end.